Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a room where your breath turns to fog even though the windows are sealed shut. Imagine a presence so old that it watched civilizations rise and fall before any of us learned to write the word evil. Now open them, because what I'm about to tell you isn't fiction. It's archaeology, and it's far more disturbing than any horror movie could ever be. You've seen The Exorcist, right? That moment when the camera lingers on the demon's face, when Regan's voice tears itself apart and rebuilds into something ancient. Millions of people left theaters traumatized, and yet almost nobody asked the simplest question. Who was that thing before Hollywood found it? What kind of entity survives for 3,000 years, hidden in clay and sand, only to claw its way back into our nightmares through a single film? His name was Pazuzu, and before you dismiss this as ancient history, understand something. He never actually left. Let me take you back, way back, to a time when demons weren't symbols or metaphors. They were filed like taxes, catalogued like weather patterns, and feared like pandemics. Because in Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, disaster always had a face and a name. These weren't people who believed in one god fighting one devil. No, their world was crowded with thousands of spirits, each controlling a different slice of suffering. Drought, disease, madness, stillbirth, famine, sudden death. They didn't see these as punishments for sin. They saw them as forces of nature, older than morality itself. And survival meant knowing which demon to bargain with and which ones to hide from. Think about that for a second. Your entire civilization built on the assumption that invisible predators are always circling, and the only thing keeping you alive is knowing their names and their rules. Now, here's where it gets interesting, and I want you to really sit with this, because it explains why Pazuzu still makes people uncomfortable even now. These demons didn't disappear when their cities fell. They mutated. Fragments of their myths that absorbed into later religions, twisted, repackaged, mistranslated, until you couldn't tell what was originally feared and what was invented later. Baal among the Canaanites, Moloch in the Levant, dozens of others whispered about in secret texts as patrons of blood cults and forbidden rituals. And even today, in the 21st century, there are occult groups convinced they're practicing rites that trace back to those original pacts, which raises a question that should bother you. What if they're right? What if something from that world is still watching? Pazuzu first appears in the archaeological record between the 9th and 4th centuries BCE, carved into clay tablets and cast in bronze amulets no bigger than your thumb. And here's what made him different from the other demons. He wasn't worshipped. He was used. Let me explain. Mesopotamians believed the southwest wind carried death. It blew hot and dry from the desert, bringing fever, miscarriage, crop failure, everything that could erase a family overnight. Whispers. And Pazuzu was that wind given form. He was the face of invisible disaster. But here's the twist that makes him so psychologically disturbing. They also believed he was strong enough to drive away other demons. Think about that logic for a second. You're terrified of a plague spirit, so your solution is to invite an even worse plague spirit to guard your home. It's like fighting fire with a flamethrower. And yet that's exactly what they did. Because in their world, survival wasn't about good versus evil. It was about managing chaos with more chaos. Women in labor wore amulets with his face pressed against their skin, not as decoration, but as shields. They were trying to keep away Lamashtu, a demoness who hunted newborns, and the only thing she feared was Pazuzu. So mothers, in their most vulnerable moments, had to choose, risk the child to one demon or trust another demon to protect them. Whispers. Imagine the psychology of that. Imagine the fear that makes that seem reasonable. Now,
let's talk about what he actually looked like, because this is where the horror becomes visual and visceral. Archaeologists have pulled hundreds of these amulets from the ground, buried under doorways, clutched in ancient graves, hidden in the walls of homes, and every single one shows the same nightmare. A humanoid torso covered in reptilian scales, feet ending in lion or eagle talons, hands tipped with curved claws, membranous wings stretched wide like a bat's, and a head that looks like a rabid dog frozen mid-snarl. Bulging eyes, flared nostrils, teeth bared in permanent rage, and from his lower body, a serpent-shaped phallus coiling downward as a grotesque symbol of fertility turned into threat. Your brain doesn't know what to do with that image because it fuses every category of predator into one form: man, beast, bird, reptile. It's designed to confuse the mind and trigger every primal alarm at once. And here's what really disturbs me about this. They deliberately kept his image small. No towering statues, no grand temples, nothing that would draw his attention, because they believed that carving him too large might summon his wrath instead of his protection. So these tiny bronze figures, small enough to hide in your fist, were the only barrier between families and annihilation. And thousands of years later, when archaeologists started digging them up, something strange began happening. Workers refused to touch them. Excavation journals describe how local laborers would wrap the figures in cloth without looking at them directly, murmuring prayers as they passed them to European scholars. Even the archaeologists, trained in rationalism and science, admitted feeling watched by those gaping bronze eyes. One explorer wrote about the hideous and malign vigor of the pieces. Another described crates going missing in sandstorms during transport, shipments arriving blackened and warped despite fair weather. Now, maybe that's all coincidence. Maybe it's just superstition bleeding into documentation. But when museums started displaying these objects publicly in the 19th century, the discomfort didn't stop. Visitors described them as fiends and heathen devils. Guards claimed the lights near them flickered without explanation. Conservators mentioned sudden migraines after handling them. And some museums quietly rotated the figures out of display for years at a time. Not because they were damaged, but because something about them felt wrong. Now, I'm not saying these objects are cursed. I'm saying they carry an idea. And that idea is powerful enough to disturb people across 3,000 years of separation. The idea that danger and protection are the same thing, that what guards you might also destroy you, that safety is just controlled threat. And that's a concept the human mind has never learned to process comfortably. So, let's jump forward past the fall of Babylon, past centuries of silence, past the Christian Middle Ages rewriting every pagan spirit into a servant of hell. Because by the time the 20th century arrived, Pazuzu was mostly forgotten, buried in academic texts that nobody read, a footnote in studies of ancient Near Eastern religion. And then, in 1971, William Peter Blatty published The Exorcist, and everything changed. Now here's what most people don't realize. Blatty could have chosen any demon from Christian lore: Beelzebub, Asmodeus, Belial. The grimoires were full of famous names. But he didn't want something familiar. He wanted something that felt older than Christianity itself, older than the Bible, older than the concept of sin. He wanted a force from before morality existed. And Pazuzu was perfect because he came from a time when evil wasn't rebellion against God, it was just nature being indifferent to human survival. Think about the genius of that choice. A medieval demon would have rules, weaknesses, a place in the cosmic hierarchy, but Pazuzu had none of that. He wasn't part of heaven's rebellion, he wasn't punishing sinners, he just was. Like a virus, like a hurricane, like radiation, he existed without purpose or mercy. and that made him far more terrifying than any devil could ever be.
William Friedkin understood this when he directed the film. He and his team actually traveled to Iraq and studied Babylonian artifacts in museums. They traced Pazuzu's exact features from ancient amulets: the dog-like head, the bulging eyes, the eagle talons, the reptilian body, and they rebuilt him as a towering statue buried in sand for that opening sequence. Not to explain the plot, but to frame the entire possession as something impersonal and ancient, something that existed long before Christianity named evil and will exist long after. That statue, looming over the Iraqi desert while the priest trembles before it, plants an idea in the viewer's subconscious. This isn't a battle between good and evil. This is an infection, a foreign presence awakening, a natural disaster with intelligence. And because most audiences had never heard of Pazuzu before, they couldn't rationalize him. They couldn't fit him into a comfortable category. He just felt hostile, like something that shouldn't be here, but is. And that's the feeling that haunted millions of people long after the credits rolled. Now let me ask you something, and I genuinely want you to think about this. Why does Pazuzu disturb us more than other demons? I mean, pop culture is full of terrifying entities, so what makes this one different? I think it's because he breaks the rules we use to feel safe. Most demons in fiction are evil, purely evil, which makes them predictable. You know they're the enemy, you know they want to destroy you, there's clarity in that. But Pazuzu was never purely anything. He brought plagues, but he also stopped worse plagues. He guarded children, but he also rode the winds that killed them. He was destroyer and protector in the same breath. And that moral ambiguity is what the human brain cannot process. Because if something dangerous is also necessary, if the monster is also the guardian, then who do you trust? That's the fear he embodies. Not violence, but the collapse of boundaries. And it's a fear that predates language itself. On a deeper level, Pazuzu represents loss of control over your own body and mind. He doesn't kill you, he inhabits you. He uses your voice, moves your limbs, twists your thoughts until you're still alive, but no longer yourself. And that taps into something universally terrifying, the fear that your identity could be erased from the inside while everyone watches. It's why possession stories still work. It's why they feel more personal than slasher films or monster movies. Because the threat isn't external, it's internal. It's the idea that you could become the danger without choosing it. And Pazuzu has been doing this for 3 millennia. In ancient Mesopotamia, he was the fever that hollowed people out, the madness that made neighbors unrecognizable, the sickness that turned familiar faces into strangers. Today, he's the demon in the exorcism, the entity that corrupts innocence, the force that makes a child speak in tongues and commit obscenities. But the mechanics are the same. Something invisible crosses a threshold, invades a body, and dissolves identity from within. That's why he never feels outdated, because the fear he targets is hardwired into human psychology. Now here's where things get modern and frankly a bit weird, because Pazuzu didn't fade back into obscurity after The Exorcist. If anything, he spread. His face started appearing on metal album covers, in role-playing game bestiaries, on tattoos, in underground art, in occult forums, and chaos magic rituals. People who had never heard of Mesopotamia were suddenly drawing his image, speaking his name, integrating him into modern esoteric practices. And some of them claim he answered. I'm not going to tell you whether that's real or not, but I will tell you this. There are documented rituals in contemporary occult circles where practitioners attempt to invoke Pazuzu directly. They blend reconstructed Babylonian chants with ceremonial magic. They use his image as a sigil for destruction and renewal. They describe him not as a personified demon, but as a current of entropy, a field of decay that dissolves boundaries between self and environment. between order and chaos.
Because what it shows is that Pazuzu has become an active symbol again. He's not a museum piece. He's not a historical curiosity. He's a living element in how modern people imagine corruption and transformation. And that brings us to what I think is the most unsettling part of this entire story: the possibility that we never stopped needing him. Think about it. The Mesopotamians used Pazuzu because they lived in a world of constant invisible threats, plagues without explanation, disasters without warning, forces they couldn't control. And what do we live in now? We live in a world of pandemics, climate collapse, political chaos, misinformation, systems breaking down faster than we can repair them. We live surrounded by threats we can't see and can't fight directly. So maybe it's not surprising that a demon who embodies uncontrollable disaster is resurfacing in our culture. Maybe we're reaching for the same psychological tools our ancestors used, giving form to the formless, naming the fear so we can pretend to negotiate with it. Some scholars call this the Pazuzu effect in modern demonology. Whenever contemporary media needs to convey something truly ancient and corrupting, it borrows his traits: the hybrid form, the invasive presence, the violation of body and mind, the moral ambiguity. He's become the template for possession stories, even when he's not named, even when creators don't realize they're copying him. His silhouette haunts every depiction of demons in film, games, literature, quietly shaping the archetype of evil as something that dissolves you from within. And here's the thing that should bother you. If an idea survives 3,000 years, if it keeps resurfacing no matter how many times it's buried, maybe it's not just an idea. Maybe it's something the human psyche genuinely needs to process. Or maybe, just maybe, it's something that's actually still here. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. This is all just superstition. These are clay figures and ancient myths. There's nothing real here. And you might be right. But explain this to me. Why do those bronze amulets still make people uncomfortable in museums? Why do conservators avoid handling them? Why did The Exorcist traumatize a generation when dozens of other horror films didn't? Why does Pazuzu's face, even now, even in a photograph, carry a weight that other demonic images don't?